Let's
Yeah.
just see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here we are. I'm with an old virtual friend. My name is Toby Miller. This is the Cultural Studies Podcast. We're hoping that I can retrieve this from the so-called cloud because we've had some technological problems. When I say we, I mean I. And my guest today is
Katie Moylan. I'm Associate Professor of Media at the University of Leicester.
wonderful to have you with us, Prof. Katie. As you know, I'm a true son of Leicester and very proud of the fact that we've just ascended into Division One, which is the third tier of football in England, because that's where we belong, because we're owned by corrupt and evil people. So
Oh
enough
no.
said. Yeah,
Okay. I should know
yeah,
that as a resident of Leicester. I should know that. But I can say when I was doing field work in the States, in Miami in particular, in 2015, when Leicester did very well at football, I
yes.
was super gratified that locals on the ground, because in Miami, many, many people follow football, international football too, and they would come up to me and they'd say, Leicester. And I don't sound like I'm from Leicester, so it was the introduction for a very kind of generative set of
How
conversations.
how many people in the US have you had to explain the pronunciation of
Oh my
Leicester?
goodness. I knew where you're going
Like
with that sentence.
thousands? Thousands?
I wouldn't say thousands, but it also sits next to Worcester sauce. It sits next to, I lived on a place called Gloucester Terrace in London for a while with my
Oh
also
yes.
American sister. And so we had to explain that to people visiting. Oh no, I'm familiar. Yes. But I also correction and correcting people, you know, do it if you need to, if it needs correcting, but maybe sometimes different pronunciations are okay, you
Oh
know?
no, quite. I don't mean correcting. I mean when
No, I
they
know.
ask, how do I say it?
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
In any
So, but
event,
many, I will say many.
apart from my Leicester question, I wonder if you would share with us, Prof, what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you? What's going on for the Prof?
Oh my goodness. Dynamizing. I remember this and I was prepared for this, Toby, but dynamizing me cautiously optimistically, I'll say my research, but preoccupying me is the current cycle of marking, which I'm just about ready to complete. I've been marking my TV students' essays. And I will say, though, that's been more heartening than I expected because I love teaching TV. I really do. But teaching TV these days, as many, other media colleagues will know, means teaching a lot of different TV because nobody's watching the same thing. You're talking about 40 students, most of them are all watching different things, which is a lot of, presents its own challenges in terms of how do we talk about the TV text, right? But I like to see their essays when I feel like, oh, you were paying attention. You have brought some of these ideas forward and come through with some of your own. So that's been heartening. So that's preoccupying me, shall we say. And the fact that we got through this semester together, myself and my students, that's also preoccupying me.
Grading, marking,
Mm, indeed.
I always found the hardest part of academia. What's the hardest
Mhm.
part of academia for you?
Oh, that's a really good question. Hardest. Ooh, the hardest part of academia versus the hardest part of teaching. The hardest part of academia for me is not teaching, that's not research. It's admin. And by difficult, I mean attendant frustrations with some of the structures. I am blessed with, awesome colleagues, so it's not them. But we're working within a set of structures. And one thing that always, this is a very meta answer actually, Toby. One thing that has always interested me and I find intriguing and kind of bizarre is that the academic role, if you're fortunate enough to have a full-time teaching research contract, research and teaching and admin or service are not, they are not overlapping areas of work. They require a very different focus and a very different set of practices. They do not play well with others, and they all kind of compete to get our attention, right? So Um, but no, for teaching, marking is hard in that oof, I feel accountable. I mean, I am accountable, but I feel accountable to the students to explain myself, which of course is my job. But then I second guess it. I'm like, I might see an amazing idea. I'm like, is that amazing idea enough to elevate and make up for other deficiencies in the essay? Do you know what I mean?
Big time. On the admin score, I guess the thing is that theoretically, I mean, much
Mhm.
less so in an authoritarian country like Britain, academics are self-governing. There is some element of democratic governance of the university, and that
Mm,
does require doing some administration, right?
yeah,
That comes with having a devolved authority.
yeah,
So some bit of it has to be done, but
yeah.
the problem is that vast amounts of it is completely unnecessary.
Thank you. That is what I have difficulty with because I do not think it's a good use of our time. I mean, I self-governing is exactly is one of the things, and a relative degree of autonomy is probably something I really enjoy about academia because I was a freelancer. I did freelance journalism before this, and in a way, for early career academics, I used to call myself a freelance academic, which is what they call an adjunct in the States, right? And I think in Canada as well, where basically you're doing contract work because
Yeah.
you're doing temporary work, which is very frustrating and very precarious and very uncomfortable for many people. But it does mean that you're your own boss, you're your own extremely badly paid boss. So the self-governing, and kind of setting my own timetable, most academics become quite good at that because we have to, because we have more demands than, the day has hours. But yeah, there are some structural ways of looking at our workload in the British context, which I do find frustrating, and I probably should expand on. But it's certainly in terms of the areas of work I find fulfilling and I find gratifying and I find generative, the admin side of reporting and relative, really, you're just kind of enacting compliance. And I feel like academia, in theory, in an ideal world, is where we expand in our ideas, and compliance is something to be scrutinized and analyzed and critiqued, and not something to adhere to, essentially.
I guess the other big thing about being a freelance academic, or what they call in Argentina, professor taxi,
Oh wow,
tax,
like a gig professor. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
you
sure.
know, freeway prof is
Right.
the is that at least you don't have to do a lot of administration. It's one of the things about being at the bottom of the pile. You're not constantly in meetings because they don't want to pay you for them. Hermano, ¿qué
Mm,
tal? And
mm.
so on. Now, this is the third time you've been on the podcast, Prof. Once on your own, and once when you kindly and wonderfully put together a really terrific session with radio stations in Leicester and New Orleans.
Yep.
And when we were chatting, just the two of us, the last time, one of the things you said was that you actually don't like podcasts very much because you're really a
Ah.
radio gal. Is fine? Have you softened? Have you been administered out of rejecting the idea of the podcast?
I think it was a naive and kind of it was a very sweeping statement, and I don't like sweeping statements, and I probably shouldn't have said it. I think at the time I was I was at an earlier stage in researching my current book, and I was reading theory, and I was also trying to read some theories around podcasting. And I was a little disenchanted. There are some great people writing about podcasts. Kim Fox is writing about it, Richard Berry, Tiziano Bonini, and many, many more, because it's this like emergent field. And in a way, podcast studies has reinvigorated radio studies. So I shouldn't complain. I should also say, Toby, whilst we're on this, we were on together another time with two other academics talking about podcasts, Caroline and Evie, and that was also in 2024, I think,
Oh
where
God,
they, that's
senior moment,
okay.
senior moment,
That's
senior moment.
okay. They made far more convincing arguments for podcasting than I was able to. I think that podcasting is a really interesting and possibly depressing, and I'm very prepared to be corrected on this. Moment though, because the celebrities have gotten hold of podcasts, and that means that has resulted for the most part in a lot of very lazy podcasts, which kind of stretch out and expand on the capacity of the podcast form to allow people to just run with the sound of their own voices. And in, simplistically, the difference between a podcast and a radio program, one is that historically a podcast, its context, its content airlifted from the radio schedule. So it's not, it's out of its time and place. But the other thing is that a radio program has a form, it has a top and tail. BBC, NPR's programming as public service broadcasters, you have like, I think, like the 7-minute item, you have station idents, there's a real running order structure. And I think that makes the form that puts manners on the form. It puts accountability on the form. And it means that people like podcasts, arguably like we're doing now, so this could be very meta, we are not allowed to go on and on and on, right? There's a form that kind of prevents that. And even community radio, where there aren't ads, there might be PSAs, public service messaging. There can be an expansiveness of conversation, but you still have a running order to adhere to. And I think that running order, is useful and important for structuring conversation, and certainly for putting together music. And so podcasts without that formal requirement can just be a little self-indulgent. Kate Lacey, who's does great work in radio studies and has done. She's quite what's the word? I'd say iconic. I don't want to embarrass her, but she does great work, and she's very much a touchstone for me in our discipline. And she's made an argument around podcasts and ways in which they kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, enable kind of an extension of the neoliberal individual. It's yet another space basically to encourage the ego and to encourage, the subject to rant on and on without listening to others. She didn't say the listening to others part, that was me, but she did say it exacerbates a neoliberal obsession with the individual narrative. And I would go with that sometimes. But then there are many good podcasts out there and which don't do that, is my very long answer.
Oh no, it's a great answer. And actually, hola, ¿qué tal? The first part really interests me. I hadn't thought about it, but it bugs me, which is celebrity podcasts all the
Oh my
time.
goodness. Oh, yeah.
Way in which, if you subscribe to podcast feeds, these are
Yeah.
thrust at you all the time
Yeah.
in favor of the things you've actually subscribed to. So I think that's a real misfortune. Of course, it's sort of inevitable. As for the neoliberal bit, I guess maybe you could say the same about the sale of tape recorders or the ability to go and cut a disc if you're a young Elvis Presley in a record store.
Okay. Yeah, I see it. Yeah, or even the invention of the microphone. Yeah. I mean, or, or the rise of YouTube, and this space where people can record themselves prior to even TikTok, right? It's the circular argument. Do we have a need to put ourselves out there and to record ourselves and make our every thought public, and where did the technology go with that? Yeah, we don't want to be too deterministic at all. So I would
And
concur.
I'm not sure how much of it's neoliberal. I think it's narcissistic, probably.
But narcissism can be considered, in the neoliberal environment, it's considered a value, right? It's like, yeah, project yourself out there, amplify everything about yourself.
Yes, but it's also often decreed a disorder
Oh, for
and a
sure.
problem.
Well, it
So
is.
I think narcissism in this case God, I hate to use the word Trump as a verb. I mean, Trump's neoliberalism because it's forever. It's Narcissus in the pool.
Yeah. Well, yeah, chicken egg though. I mean, the inherentness of narcissism has assisted the neoliberal project, no? I would
Exactly.
I would say they're intertwined. I hear you also on not using the T word. I keep saying supersede, but that doesn't always work in terms of the sentence. But yes.
I've got to I've got to look up, I suppose people still use Roget's thesaurus somewhere. It must be online,
Hmm.
rather than the other means of finding alternatives, synonyms.
Yes. Yeah, I think we all have to. I think that's a mini project we could all get behind. Definitely. Just take the word right out of the vocabulary.
Can we now move on to
Yes.
the new book, which I'm incredibly excited about? Do you do you have a title? Can you tell us when it's coming out? We want the
Sure.
full scoop, Prof. Your listeners demand it.
Both of them. Hi, guys. Sorry, not that your podcast isn't popular. I'm just talking about mine. Um, yeah, no, I'm excited about it. It was very fulfilling and immersive to write. And when you look up from writing something like that, you're always, concerned or anxious that it will be any good, basically. It's had some title changes, but now it is called Radiologics, with a subtitle of Sustaining Structures of Feeling in Crisis Times. And it's my third radio book. I think my next book has to not be about radio. I think I should start writing about something else. But it basically argues that for the robustness of radio, and it argues that radio, and by radio I mean linear radio, scheduled radio, remains a very active, multifaceted site for community-led, not just community-led, but also for community-led articulations, expressions, in place-specific ways. I think radio forms, scheduled radio stations that have material studios in a particular location, in a place. You can be a great radio station and be purely online. There's some great radio out there that does that. But I think that radio, unlike podcasts, unlike many podcasts, still can be rooted in place and can amplify the values of a group of people, of a set of communities that are located both in place, but also in terms, increasingly, really, in these crisis times, in shared values. And I think it's this really powerful site for the expression and articulation of those shared values. And the book takes you through some examples of where that has happened. So radio, public radio in Hawaii, community radio in Hawaii, in Oahu and Kauai. And I have a chapter too on North Carolina public radio stations and community stations' responses to Hurricane Helene, and the care that they expressed for each other and how they supported their local communities, cutting through sometimes political differences, profound political differences. I have a chapter on activist radio out of New Orleans, and the book begins with an exploration of radio from the start of the COVID lockdowns in 2020, which really galvanized the whole thing. I was, I can tell you a story from that if that's of interest.
100%. Go ahead, Prof.
Now, anyone listening, this is what I mean by people talking throughout a podcast, no running order, no structure. So I am the problem. I admit it. I'm going to tell the story anyway, because it's not about me. It's about the Hopi radio station in Arizona, North Arizona. So for the Hopi tribal people, that's KUII. And I was in North America. I was based in Texas on a fellowship, which I was granted by the EU, the EU Marie Curie Global Fellowship. And I was there to talk to practitioners of Native American radio, which is what many of the tribal radio stations call themselves. They'd also call themselves tribal radio. Very few of them call themselves indigenous radio. So I try to use all the terms that they themselves use, sometimes also American Indian. So KUII is a Hopi station, and I had a scheduled visit there in March 2020. And myself and my partner were driving out there from Texas, and I think it was March 15th. The calendar for 2020 would confirm it, but it was the Monday in March, in mid-March, when it became clear that we were, experiencing the start of a pandemic. At that time, the Trump president was in power in the States. And there was an interview that morning in our hotel room that we were watching from our hotel room on TV, where he was arguing with Fossey. and downplaying it, of course. And myself and my partner looked at each other and were like, what is even going on? What's the right thing to do? But Hopi hadn't, two other stations I was due to see in the next couple of days did cancel, quite rightly. But we drove out to Hopi and they welcomed me in, and they said, obviously we were going to do an interview, but we're pivoting because we're having a crisis meeting, but you can sit in if you would like. And I said, thank you so much. And I felt very honored to be included.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
amazingly generous.
Very, yes. And I'd met them before. I'd been there before in 2017, where I wrote about them in my second book, The Cultural Work of Community Radio. So we did know each other. But I felt very honored, and I was very, it was, what was immediately apparent was that they were taking the crisis, the pandemic, seriously, whereas this bullshit interview that I was seeing on, Fox. It wasn't Fox TV because we wouldn't watch that from our hotel room, but it was like an interview with Trump and between Trump and Fossey, a conversation between Trump and Fossey, which is downplaying this pandemic. Meanwhile, in Hopi, they're already using hand sanitizers. They're talking about distancing. They were on it. They were on it, and the other tribal stations that I spoke to were the same. They had a level of preparedness because this was not their first rodeo. This was not their first pandemic. This was not their first crisis. And they were therefore much, and I write about this in the first chapter of the book, they're much more ably prepared to counter it and to negotiate it. But I won't go on too much more about this meeting, but what I do remember is they talked about the door to the studio, to the radio station. So the radio station at that time was a big room with some smaller rooms off the side and like a loo and a kitchen. And, they started the meeting after we went round the group saying, how is everyone feeling and coping, which is also amazing to see and not something that you get in a lot of university meetings. And then they talked about the door and should they keep it open or closed, and what people in the community would feel about that, and would they feel welcomed or not, and how important that is versus actual safety concerns. And so the door became this symbol, but also a strategic point of discussion. And it just seemed to me that they were talking about all the right things. They were caring for each other. They saw the crisis. I didn't know what to make of, none of us who hadn't seen this kind of medical, humanitarian, social, and became political crisis before. We didn't know what to do, but they did. And so I feel very grateful to have been part of that. That's been written about. I've written about that already elsewhere. But that got me thinking, because the more I spoke to community radio stations, including Eva FM in Leicester, which I haven't written about, they were pivoting to care for their communities in delivery mechanisms, in vocabulary, in framings that their community of listeners would understand. And I saw that happening. I did not see that happening in mainstream radio. We went back to Texas and Dallas, mainstream radio was on I couldn't even tell you, I don't know, some commercial station. It was on our car radio, and it was a sports station because it was Dallas, and they had no sports and they had no content. And they were flailing, Toby. They had these are people on huge salaries, and they did not know what to do. Very long answer. Please ask more questions.
Listen, long answers are fine, as long as they're not narcissistic or neoliberal.
Fair.
But in all seriousness, that is a wonderful story, very telling. And of course, by way of background, as is the case with many First Peoples or Indigenous peoples, Native peoples, they've experienced so many imported diseases that have decimated their numbers over the centuries that they have probably some sort of sophisticated early warning system, which is look out, because we know what they're bringing to us next.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there's a preparedness there. Absolutely. There really is. And it was emotional as well as logistical. And it was just, absolutely preparedness.
And Prof, my next question is about my experience, which I may have talked to you about this before. Gracias. In my callow youth, i.e. in my 40s and 50s, when I owned a car, driving through the Midwest, the only stations I could get were Christian.
Yes.
No sports stations, no NPR affiliates. You're on a big freeway or a big road or whatever. This is what you get. And I was reminded of this watching some supposedly high quality limited series on HBO Max, as it's called here still. When this was discussed, it was mentioned en passant. And I wanted, if you, for non-US listeners or non-Midwest listeners, if you could give a flavor of that world that's so powerful, where you can sometimes be moving between Christian radio, maybe some NPR, and highly networked, very centralized commercial radio. This is the slightly more dystopic part of it, if you like.
No, absolutely. And I mean, in that point, and I think you made that point to me when we were talking about the book before, and it's an essential point because I spend so much time being happy to hear about and heartened by and struck by and impressed by the community-led work of stations that are doing progressive work. And there are so many. There are so many. But yeah, right alongside that, and really cheek by jowl, as you described, there are also small community-run stations. They're either owned by a growing network of kind of Christians, of not kind of Christian stations, or are just otherwise very conservative, or they buy in kind of conservative talk show hosts, kind of like Fox News, except for radio. And it's my mother and I mean, it's not just the Midwest either. My mother and I were in Florida in 2023. It's not a place we would no, I'm not gonna say that. I've also friends and great people are in Florida. But Florida is experiencing a lot of the difficulties that are being imposed by the Trump administration is all I'm saying. But you know, so is the rest of the US. It's complicated and difficult. It's always hard to start talking about this. I must stop. At that time, Florida was, we were driving from, I guess it was outside of Clearwater, a bit north of there, and we drove from Florida towards New Orleans. So we experienced and cycled through a bunch of different stations. Once in a while, I'd find a college station, and college stations, university radio stations, are usually progressive. They usually have interesting music because they are still, you know, they still feature a schedule with shows by and for student DJs. And if you're a young person who wants to do a radio show these days, where radio itself, you know, has been a bit more marginalized, you're going to be playing exciting music. So that was always the goal. But in and amongst those tiny pockets of like fantastic and unlooked for and surprising music, you would get flat out Christian stations where basically it was a sermon on air. And you can tell it immediately, and you'll know this, Toby, from the aesthetics. You know, it's that thundering. Um, Usually it sounded like a white guy yelling from a pulpit somewhere, you know, that was being broadcast all over the airwaves. So you have that next to, then you might have another local station, and then you have an NPR affiliate. And then NPR affiliates vary in their programming, which is something else I've written about alongside other people who've written much more about NPR, like Josh Shepard and Laura Garbus, amongst so many others. So NPR affiliates can have nationalized programming, which I'm going to digress a bit now. I should say nationally syndicated programming, which, you know, it's things like All Things Considered, which there's writing around that, where there's a kind of evenness of accent and delivery, which is at odds, I feel like, with a kind of localized feel and mode of expression. So anyway, those affiliates can either be broadcasting local shows or nationally syndicated shows. But I've digressed.
I want us to go back in time, Prof, 30
Mhm.
years. I went to an event at the Museum of Broadcasting, I think it was then called, in New York,
Okay. Yes, yeah.
where there were two guests. The principal one, Rush Limbaugh, a
Oh my
name now,
God.
a name now probably forgotten,
Ugh,
and
well, thankfully, yes.
the other guest, whose name I have forgotten, was his boss at the network. And one of the points his boss made was that when we syndicated Rush's show around the country, we lost listeners massively compared to local call-in shows that were being run. many fewer people were listening, but we made more money because it meant we could bring in national advertisers.
Yeah.
Instead of getting Katie and Toby's podcast as a sponsor, we got GM, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Rush did not look happy when his boss said this, but I loved it because of its political economic take, which is this is not necessarily about popularity at the sort of national networked level.
Yeah.
And there is something about this local element that you began with that matters even in that hyper commercial and hyper politicized world. For listeners who are lucky enough never to have seen him, would you mind giving us a quick burst on Limbaugh and why he's important? Because I think he is a harbinger, pardon me, of a lot of what we see and hear.
Oh, I think you're going to have more to say about him because I don't fully remember. It was fully anecdotal, you know. He represented a terrifying conservative voice that was very thunderous and very loud. He was alongside people like, I want to say Howard Stern, but I could be wrong. I feel like Howard Stern was kind of more complicated. But he was pointed to, yeah, as the problem, as amplifying the worst conservative, well, boiling down ideas in a via a conservative agenda, and so scaremongering sometimes, and just, you know, presenting the worst aspect of news stories of issues being debated. But I think you could be much more precise than that, because, like I say, my memory is only anecdotal. But he was metonymical, right? He represented a bigger thing than himself, for sure.
I'm sorry, I'm aging you quite inappropriately because you're too young to remember the kind of remember personally the figure he was. So I'm sorry for what ethnomethodologists would call membershiping you with me, but it was horrendous. And one of the things he did in this live performance was mock Rodney King, saying, "Can't
Oh,
we all
good
just get
God.
along?"
Oh, I did not know that. Oh, that's
Oh, yeah,
horrific.
it was horrific. And I had only just moved to the US. I didn't know what he was saying. But the
Yeah.
audience, which was mostly clearly far right wing, erupt in hysteria, particularly the only black man in the audience.
Oh my
And
God.
I didn't get it. I'd never heard of Rush Limbaugh. I was just there because my girlfriend said, "This is interesting, let's go." When she explained it to me, I was gobsmacked.
Mm.
I mean, really appalled, as was she. And we nearly walked out. But I'm glad we didn't because later on we got to the network head making the point about Limbaugh not very popular. And of course, the other thing about Limbaugh, with a lot of these other phone-in guys of the right, is that
Yeah.
the callers are massively screened, and not screened for not being drunk
Yes.
or high or
Right.
inarticulate. They're screened for saying the correct line,
Yeah.
and they don't represent anything in the sense of a scientific sample, but are often regarded as such. And this
Yeah.
relates also to the way in which things like X or Facebook or
Mm.
TikTok or any of these outlets, Instagram, are regarded as some kind of sample of public opinion when some huge percentage of their followers and interlocutors are robotic, literally robotic. And this is one of the things that worries me. But when the talk in or phone in, talk
Yeah.
radio functions in some sort of fair way, do you see it as having a democratic aspect, something
I,
to
fu-
value as a genre?
I fully do. I'm really glad you asked that question. I have very strong feelings about call-ins. And at community radio level, they're the opposite to what you say. They aren't. But the difference is, and the difference is at a community, and I should say that community radios don't usually do call-ins anymore because of the labor involved and because they are unpredictable. Because of a huge difference between community station, including smaller NPR affiliates, I must say, is you just have less staff. So you don't have the banks of people screening calls for these national platforms. You know, really the person who is on the microphone might also be driving the desk, as we used to say, and they might also be picking up the phone and only asking one or two questions, if that, before putting the person on air. So it's less mediated, but that can be really important because it means people have access. And one of the earliest pieces of research I did for my PhD was for a community station in Dublin, where they had a show called The African Show by two presenters, one from South Africa and one from Nigeria. And they would get callers in from other, African migrant communities, but not just African migrants, to Dublin, which was relatively new at that time, to talk about their experiences of migration. And it was really important because RTE, which is a national public service broadcaster in Ireland, was trying to produce diverse and what they then called multicultural programming. But it was it was kind of that celebration of difference without really enabling or providing people the voice to speak, or, space on the airways. They were talking about communities and not enabling communities to talk for and about themselves. So in contrast, this community station had this call-in section, The African Show, and people would call in and talk about experiencing racism and what to do about it. And that discourse wasn't happening anywhere, because the internet was not working. The internet, it was when it was all long bulletin boards and discussions, but it wasn't social media as we know it now. So now, and I've written about this in the book, what has happened as community radio stations have moved away from the call-in because it is unwieldy. They will go to live tweeting or to X. Previously, they might have used Twitter. Now, sometimes they use Facebook. And Facebook is a very problematic, very contested, very extractivist platform. However, stations can use it for free, and a lot of I don't know about for free, but they can use it easily. And I know that many of their listeners find it accessible. So what you do get, and what you have gotten for at least 5 or 6 or 7 years, are some community stations putting on part of their show on Facebook. And one of the shows I've written about in the book did that during the COVID lockdowns, out of New Orleans. And I would listen from England 6 hours in advance. So it'd be about 10 p.m. my time. It's 4 p.m. their time. I'd have a glass of wine, and they would come on air and live broadcast, and people would come on to the message board and talk about their concerns about COVID. And it was amazing. It was just such a communal experience. So democratic, but even beyond democratic, I actually think it was generating a kind of commons.
Sorry for the cough. It happened just at the moment when I unmuted myself. Prof.
Isn't that
Moylan is
always a way? That's the freshness of radio, you see, liveness.
the cough button that doesn't always match the moment of needing to cough. Prof. Moylan, what's the diagnosis and the prognosis for radio? What's had to change? What's changing in terms of not only technology, but also patterns of ownership and control and so on? For example, in the US now, we have a Federal Communications Commission that is
Yes.
run by
Yes.
far-right
Yes.
ignoramuses,
Yeah.
which we've never had before. Even when they were neoliberal Republicans, they were not idiots and they
No.
were not far-right. We've got an Office of Communications, whatever it's called, Ofcom in Britain, that is
Mhm.
abjectly failing in its legislative duty to ensure that there is balance in the way stories of note, of current affairs importance are told. So and we've got also new owners of many radio outlets that are wanting editorial control in ways that are unprecedented. So it's not
Yeah.
just about the internet or podcasts or those technological changes. It's also about political economic transformations in power in terms of government and corporations. Now, there's a mansplaining question for you, if ever there was one.
Here's my question. It's not really a question. You must go down really well at conferences, Toby. No, it's a great question. And these structural, this is also something I've tried to keep in front of, keep up with in the book, because I was writing a lot of it this time last year when attacks on nothing less than free speech in US media, including US radio, was absolutely underway. The FCC gained Brendan Carr, and started doing things even over a year ago. It tried to penalize a San Francisco station because it was, or Bay Area station because it was giving information about ICE agents in the area, which to my mind is what local radio is for, right? Keeping your community safe and informed. And so they tried to penalize that station. That was over a year ago. Yeah, there are structural. I'll stick to the U.S. case, but certainly Ofcom is not like BBC. It is not giving a balanced set of platforms. I don't believe. No, certainly not in relation to Israel and to Palestine. In case of the US, yeah, they shut down the Corporation of Public Broadcasting in January 5th, I think, of 2026. Before that, there have been there's ongoing attacks, not only on public media and defunding of public media and public and NPR, but also structurally on things like ways in which community organizations can get and declare and use their funding. So the attacks, unlike the actual president, are systemic and well thought through and thorough, and they're terrifying. What I do think has also happened I know has happened alongside that, is that there have been ongoing meetings with community broadcasters, with people in the Pacifica group amongst themselves. I've sat in on some of these. I've been honored and privileged to be able to, help just learn from these conversations about the many ways in which people are coalition building and building solidarity between community media, between NPR and Pacifica stations. Sometimes, although everyone is scrambling and struggling, to keep their stations afloat, these stations always depended on donors, and donors sometimes can determine programming. That's another conversation. The sector is in structural trouble. However, what keeps emerging alongside that is the work that these community stations are doing with things like Hurricane Helene, with things like, when you have disasters in Hawaii and islands, for things like Maui and things, they rally as well for fundraising and to provide community support and provide community information. Work is being done on the ground all the time by a lot of community stations, not only in the States, but the States in the US. And because there are enough platforms to amplify that, what is also happening and has been happening is because streaming technologies are more reliable now. Unlike podcasts, where, as you said much earlier, you have to be a member, you have to subscribe, you can still stream community programs around the world. So we can access these things. So my hope is, which is very idealistic of me, is that these shows and stations from small place-based stations, but also from NPR sometimes, can form a kind of commons, an alternative set of media sites, and their multiplicity can also be their strength. That's another long answer. It's going to be the Katie monologue hour, but that is part of what I think about the future of radio.
Can I ask you a slightly off-center query at this point, or pose a slightly off-center query?
Certainly, sure.
Which is, we've referred to a number of genres: talk, current affairs, community access, phone-ins, sport, music, but not what is sometimes called spoken word. There's a very important history in radio of drama.
Yes.
And of poetry.
Yeah.
And not of religious God-bothering, but of considered commentary on questions that are religious.
Yeah.
Like one of the tasks of the BBC on radio, for example, is to have a Sky pilot offering some meditations late at night.
Yes,
to make
or Sunday mornings. Yeah.
Sunday mornings.
Sure.
So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about spoken word stuff, where that is in your imaginary, especially things like drama.
Oh, that is not something I write about. I do have colleagues who write about this, and the one who comes to mind, but he also writes about podcasts, is Neil Verma out of Northwestern University, and I think he's written a lot about radio drama. He's not the only one, so I'd have to follow up with further recommendations on that. What I will say, not being an expert in radio drama or spoken word, it's still a medium that does lend itself to it because its primary affordance is still the voice and all the emotion and affect that a voice can communicate. I feel like the radio play is a beautiful genre in itself because you are forced to just listen to the voices, and the voices do all the work in world building that TV, does so easily for us by just capturing our eyes. But like if we don't have that layer, if we don't have that register, and we must rely only on our ears, radio is so powerful, and it can be the perfect site, I think, for spoken word, for everything from spoken word to drama, and to philosophical conversations. I don't know if ours counts, but I think that that can be some of the best uses and the most creative uses of the medium. Yes.
And my last question, Prof, and once you've answered it, want to give you every opportunity to add anything you want in general. But my last question is a bit like a search committee pondering your candidacy. So
Oh,
my
yikes.
apologies for that. You've
Okay.
just finished. You've just finished this new book. But what's on the docket? Do you have a vision for what's next? Or is it one of these moments when you need to lie back, go to sleep for 6 months, and so on?
No, that's a cool question. I'm here for that question. As a final note about the book, before I answer the question more directly, I will also say about radio, I say this to my students every year. Um, Radio is never just about radio. Radio for me is a lens. It's about making sense, to use that cultural studies term, of the paradigm around us of time and space. And so it has been my way to explore that and to analyze that. And indeed, media forms and formats allow us to do that too, right? They're not just about what's happening in their particularities, but also what they're amplifying in the wider world. Next up, I've written some articles a few years back about TV aesthetics, and I would like to go back to that. But I also teach television. I teach television studies. And I also wrote one article where I talk about the uses of community radio for a module I had used to teach, where students would put together their own programs. So all of these coalesce around ideas of critical pedagogies, which I think is always of interest. And I'm, talking about people who've written much more about this, always from, I never pronounce his name properly, so please correct me because I think you probably do. Paulo Freire, always, right? And this idea of where we must meet people, perhaps particularly students where they live. We must meet them where they live so that together we can build a pedagogy, but also people like Henry Giroux and other people writing about radical possibilities in pedagogy. I think I want to return to that and write more about it and develop more research about that with others, because the academy is also in crisis, and this might be a way to counter that in a meaningful way, to put it mildly and simplistically. So that will probably be next.
Prof. Katie, thank you so, so much. Anything you want to add?
No, I'm just realizing I just gave these huge blocks of text of speaking. So I think I'm talked out for now, but thanks as ever for the opportunity to go on and on about my book in this instance today.
Lovely.